Dr. Naselli is not new to most of our church family, but just in case, let me give you a brief introduction before he comes. I first met Dr. Naselli in seminary. I was a seminary student attending Faith Bible Seminary in Lafayette, Indiana, and he was my systematic theology professor. And oh, the intriguing things that he taught me. We had a great class or series of classes through that. I believe he also taught me biblical theology. But I so appreciate Brother Naselli. God's gifted him in many ways. And one of the gifts that God has given him is he has a great ability at taking complex things and presenting them in a very clear and direct and logically tight manner. And his gift of teaching has been such an encouragement to me. It has been a blessing with our pastoral interns to know that as they're in the Master Divinity program at Faith, they too have had Dr. Naselli for their systematic theologies and for some other courses as well. And so he's just been a blessing to our church. He's been here several times. If you haven't heard him, you're in for a treat. He's authored several books. He teaches up at Bethlehem College and Seminary, and he's getting ready to start a church, Christ the King Church in Stillwater, Minnesota. All right, Dr. Naselli, you come and minister the word.
It's my joy to speak to you this morning on God's good design for men and women. So here's the plan for this morning. We're going to have two parts in this morning's sermon. First part is a little bit of setting the table for what's the spectrum of major views that people hold on men and women. And then I'm going to zoom in and talk about two different ways that people who claim the label complementarian differ. I'll explain what that label means in a minute. And then I'm going to transition to giving key arguments for a particular view of God's design for men and women. I have 6 arguments, and I might get through 4 of them this morning. Now, this is going to be one way in the sermon, but in the adult Bible fellowship that follows afterwards, it will be 2-way. So as I'm speaking this morning, if you have a question, write it down, and then we can talk about that afterwards, God willing. So let's start with this first part. What is the spectrum of major views that people hold on men and women? I'm going to start with that question. So what I'm asking is, how does God intend for men and women to flourish in 3 spheres? The home, the church, and society at large. And this topic has been controversial among professing Christians, among evangelicals, for about the last 50 years. It's a new controversy. And people today hold a spectrum of views on men and women. So here's one way to lay out a spectrum. Think of it from far left to far right, something like this. So on the far left, you have what I'm calling LGBTQ plus activism. That is, I'd say, the reigning ideology in our culture right now. And then a little bit to the right are 3 forms of feminism. So one is radical feminism. That rejects the Bible and Christianity. And they claim that Christianity and the Bible has a patriarchal bias that's wrong. And then a little bit to the right of that is reformist feminism. So that uses the Bible as a means to construct a positive theology for women. So it's not really trying to interpret the Bible according to what the authors intended, but using that for something else. And then there's this view called evangelical feminism, or another name for it is egalitarianism. This is a little bit closer to home, where professing Christians would say that the Bible, rightly interpreted, teaches complete gender equality. So here's an example. I have here as the example CBE. That stands for Christians for Biblical Equality. They have their own organization based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Here's what their mission statement says. CBE exists to promote the biblical message. So they're saying this is what the Bible teaches. The biblical message that God calls women and men of all cultures, races, and classes to share authority equally in service and leadership in the home, church, and world. CBE's mission is to eliminate the power imbalance between men and women resulting from theological patriarchy. That's a very common view among professing Christians. Then, number 5 is what some call complementarianism. Notice there's an E here, comple, not with an I, like I pay someone a compliment. That's with an I. This is with an E, complement. I have the example here is CBMW. That stands for the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. That's an organization that champions this view. And that term, complementarianism, summarizes the theological view of a statement called the Danvers Statement. And here's the gist. Men and women are both equal in value and dignity, and they are beneficially different according to God's design. So I believe this is what the Bible teaches. I'm going to circle back to that in just a moment. And then on this spectrum, number 6 is authoritarianism, which is males selfishly misusing their authority with a kind of hyper headship. Okay, so that's the spectrum. Now what I'd like to do is ask, what are 2 major types of complementarianism, that 5th view? What are 2 major types of complementarianism today? So over the past 30 years, this view called complementarianism has matured, and now some people want to use that label. That they believe men and women complement each other. They want to use that label, but they're using it on a spectrum. Some more over on the farther left would be a little looser and closer to evangelical feminism than some on the right. So I want to compare and contrast these 2 different views. And these labels are relatively new. I'm calling it narrow complementarianism or ideological complementarianism, as opposed to broad or natural complementarianism. So both of these views would say that men and women are equally in God's image, that men and women are biologically different, men and women are complementary. So that's why they're both complementarian. But here's where they differ. So this first row here is how they differ on manhood and womanhood, and the narrow view has a narrow application, hence the word narrow. So here's what I mean by that. This view would say that God requires men and women to relate differently to each other narrowly in only 2 specific areas. In marriage, so in marriage, a husband is the head of his wife, and in ordination. So only men may be elders, pastors. So this view is reluctant to define manhood and womanhood specifically. It's reluctant to specify differences between men and women beyond the obvious biological ones. And it's quick to point out that complementarians use lots of stereotypes when they talk about men and women. So that's a narrow view. The broad view is applying God's design for men and women broadly to not just the home and not just the church, but to society, to all of life. So here's a definition of manhood and womanhood by a pastor named Bobby Jamieson. I think this is very good. If you haven't noticed yet, I'm on this category here. All right, so Bobby Jamieson says, manhood and womanhood are the potential to be a father or mother in both biological and metaphorical senses. To father is not only to procreate, but to provide, protect, and lead. To mother is not only to nurture life physically, but to nurture every facet of life, to care comprehensively and intimately. Such a good definition because it's true for single men, it's true for single women, not just married men and married women. So that's one difference, is the application of this narrowly or broadly. And then another difference is how they talk about marriage. They agree that a husband is the head of his wife, and he should lovingly lead his wife, in unselfishly, sacrificially serving her. They agree a wife should submit to her husband, which entails gladly and intelligently following him. But here's where they disagree. The narrow view tends to emphasize what they call mutual submission, and not emphasize that a husband has authority. The broad view tends to emphasize a God-designed hierarchy between a husband and wife, in which a husband has real authority. So this narrow view would focus on authority as giving away your authority. That's what good leadership is giving away your authority. And this broad view would say, well, the authority is an actual authority that men should use well. So that's one difference here. And then in the area of the church, this third row here, they both believe that only qualified men should be ordained. But here's a big difference. The narrow view would say an unordained woman may do anything an unordained man may do. So if you would have an unordained man preach a sermon, then a woman should be able to do that. If you'd have an unordained man teach a Sunday school class, then a woman should be able to do that. If you'd have an unordained man be a deacon, then a woman should do that. So that's the reasoning. And then the broad view would say only qualified men should teach and exercise authority over the church, and this includes the function, not merely the office, of the pastor. So this is marriage, the church, and this last row is society. The narrow view is reluctant to specify how men and women should function differently in society. The broad view doesn't. It says that the different ways that God designed men and women apply to how men and women function in society. For example, this view is more willing to say something like this. Some vocations out in the world are appropriate for only males, like serving in a combat role in the military. And the narrow view would be real hesitant to go there. And some other ways I'd compare and contrast these. For the narrow view, I'd say that their instincts, their theological instincts differ in this way. They would say that the biggest problem facing the church today is that men abuse their authority in the home and the church. So we should emphasize that men and women are equal. So that's their instinct. And then the broad view differs. They'd say men have misused their authority throughout human history. That's not new. The biggest problem now is that our culture rejects God-designed differences between men and women. So while our culture is going off the rails, we should emphasize that God made men and women differently, with complementary differences, that God also has given men authority in the home and church. And interestingly, their theological method, the way they get to their conclusions differ. The narrow view tends to be more biblicist in the sense that they narrowly affirm that God requires men and women to relate differently in only two areas, in marriage and ordination, because that's all the Bible explicitly addresses. And then the broad view tends to include nature. So it's affirming the different roles for men and women because of not just interpreting the Bible in explicit passages and theology, but also natural revelation, what God has revealed to all people. So another question here, as you look at this, maybe you guys saw that label complementarianism and you thought, how is that different than patriarchy? Maybe you've heard that word patriarchy, and it's a bad word for a lot of people in our culture. It connotes bad things. But the word patriarchy means father rule. So if that's all you're meaning by it, is that the father has a God-designed authority in various spheres, I think that both labels are fitting. Complementarianism and biblical patriarchy are fitting terms. So patriarchy emphasizes that God designed fathers to rule. God designed both complementarity and hierarchy. Complementarianism, that label emphasizes that men and women complement each other. They're not interchangeable. So I like both labels. I think it's interesting. There's a big book in the 90s edited by John Piper and Wayne Grudem called Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. And then the response to that book by the Center Christians for Biblical Equality, so it's egalitarians responding to it. The title of that
response has the subtitle, it's Discovering Biblical Equality, subtitle, Complementarity Without Hierarchy. So the feminist view wants complementarity. What they're rejecting is hierarchy. That's really where the debate is do men in the church, in the home, have God-designed hierarchy, authority? Well, what matters most is not the label you give it, complementarianism or patriarchy. What matters most is what we mean by those labels. So that's what I'm going to spend the rest of the time with. But before I do that, I have 4 short exhortations to you. Number 1 is study this issue for yourself. I was so pleased to see that there are books in the lobby that will help you with this. So talk to your pastors to get advice on what resources would be helpful if you'd like to study God's design for men and women more deeply. Second exhortation is beware of the ditches on either side of complementarianism. So on one side would be a hyper-headship where men sinfully misuse the authority God has given them. And we reject that. We call it sin. There's no excuse for that. So beware of that. And then on the other side would be evangelical feminism or egalitarianism. That's another ditch. So just be aware of which one are you more inclined to err. Which side of the horse are you more likely to fall off? And be aware of that. Number 3, discern. Oh, that's what I just said. I guess I just combined them. I should look ahead of my notes. All right, discern which ditch you're more likely to fall into. Here's a good test. If you had the opportunity to preach a sermon or teach a Sunday school class or meet with a small group or counsel your family on one of 2 texts, which would you be more likely to choose? Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. That's text number 1. Text number 2, wives, submit to your husbands as unto the Lord. And my guess, I don't know you all, my guess is that most of you would be more inclined to go with husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, and let it rip. Like fastball down the middle, and treat those guys like a thermos in the back of a pickup truck. Boom, 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 boom. You heard a sermon like that on Father's Day, right? I don't know how they preach them here, but Father's Day is a typical day where guys are like that thermos in the back of the pickup truck. Well, have you ever heard a Mother's Day sermon like that? Where here are the ways that women are prone to sin. Be aware of this. Like, why is that? Why are we more prone to go after the guys and we're afraid to talk about feminine sins? That's just something to ask yourself. What is it about our culture that even influences how prone we are to address issues that the Bible addresses? So just be aware of your own instincts and inclinations. And finally, number 4, love and celebrate how God has designed men and women. So I'll tell you a story here. I had the privilege of serving for a New Testament scholar named D.A. Carson. And he told me that one time he was counseling a couple on these matters. And they were evangelical feminists, so egalitarians. And they worked through passage after passage after passage. And finally, they said something like this to Don. They said, all right, you convinced us. We agree the Bible teaches complementarianism. But we still don't like it. And Don said to them, good, you're halfway there. What did he mean by that? Well, it's good to agree with what the Bible teaches. It's better to understand why it's correct and to love it. So this is something that parents know with their kids. You have rules that you teach them. And your goal is not that they blindly obey the rules. If your kids are just blindly obeying the rules, that's an immature obedience. They're just doing what dad said or mom said. They don't understand why. Okay, I'll do it because they said. A mature obedience recognizes the reason, the good reason for the rules, and they love the standard. That's the goal. And that's the goal with our kids, and that's the goal for us as God's children, is not only to recognize that what God says is the way it should be, but to understand why that's good and to love that standard. That's where we want to be. Love and celebrate how God has designed men and women. You'll just notice, I'm just done with approaching this topic on tiptoes, afraid to say what the Bible says. It's time to just shout it out. God is brilliant in his design for men and women. Here's what it is. Let's love it. I think that's actually, in our culture, it's ripe for that. For so long, we've been afraid to say what it is. Let her rip. Let her rip. All right, so now what I'm going to do is give some key arguments for biblical patriarchy or broad complementarianism. I have 6 arguments, and I think I'll get through the first 4, and then we'll break. And then in the next session, I'll share the next 2 and do Q&A throughout that. So I'm going to give 6 arguments, 4 in the sermon, for this broad complementarianism or biblical patriarchy. Argument number 1, God designed male headship before the fall. Foundational principles in Genesis 1-3. And you might be wondering, how's that an argument? Well, the reason is some evangelical feminists argue that this authority, this hierarchy between men and women that exists in the home and the church is a result of the fall. It's a result of sin. It's not the way it should be. But prior to the fall, that's not the way it was. So here are some arguments, 9 of them, that God designed male headship in marriage before the fall. And these are from Wayne Grudem. I'll paraphrase him. 1 is the order. God created Adam first, and then Eve. That's significant. It's the law of primogeniture. And you say, does the Bible emphasize that as being significant? It does. In 1 Timothy 2, 13, 14, around there. That's one of the reasons that undergird God's good design for men having authority in marriage and in the church. Number 2 is the representation. Who has a special role in representing the human race? Is it Adam and Eve? Is it just Eve? Is it just Adam? The answer is, it's just Adam. You go read Romans 5, 1 Corinthians 15. Who is the representative head of the human race? It's Adam. And by the way, there are just 2 races. Those in Adam and those in Christ. And then third, you have the naming of woman. The person doing the naming of created things is always the person who has authority over those things. So Adam names the animals, and then Adam names Eve. Then, I combine them. So we have the naming of the woman and the naming of the human race. So this is just an extension of that. God named the human race what? Adam. Mankind, not womankind. 5 is the primary accountability. In Genesis 6, it's hard to see this if you're reading the English text. When Adam and Eve sin, I think it's Genesis 3, verse 6, God says, "Where are you?" That word "you," it's hard to see this in English. If you're Southern, you know the difference between you and y'all. So if I'm looking at Pastor Lehman, I could say, "You are a good man." You are. And if I'm talking to the group, I can say, "Y'all. Y'all are fine people." All right? Y'all. You, y'all. So what is it when God says, "Where are you?" Is it "where are you" singular, or "where are y'all," Adam and Eve? You might think it's "where are y'all." It's not. It's singular. When he comes, "Where are you, Adam?" He's not calling Eve. He's calling Adam. That's significant because Adam was a person who was primarily accountable. You know, what he should have done in the garden was kill the dragon and get the girl. He was responsible to protect his wife, and he didn't. He stood by there passively. He was accountable. And then number 6 is the purpose. Eve was created as a helper for Adam. Adam was not created as a helper for Eve. Number 7 is the conflict. The curse brought a distortion of previous roles. It didn't introduce new roles. You read it in Genesis 3 in the teens in there. And then number 8 is the restoration. When we come to the New Testament, salvation in Christ reaffirms the creation order. And then number 9 is the mystery. Marriage, from the beginning, was a picture of the relationship between Christ and the church. Does Christ submit to the church? No. That perish the thought. So marriage itself exists to be a shadow of that reality, not vice versa. So those are 9 reasons, and embedded in those arguments are foundational principles that apply to more than just marriage, which we'll talk about in a moment. So that is our first argument. God designed male headship before the fall. Second argument, male headship is fitting. Talk about the logic of 1 Timothy 2, 8-15, and 1 Corinthians 11, 7-9. I'm going to come back to that word fitting and explain why it's so important here. So let's first look at 1 Timothy 2, 12-14. Here's what Paul writes. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. The next word introduces 2 reasons. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. That word for is really important. It's giving 2 reasons, 1 and 2. 2 reasons for the prohibition. So the first reason is God formed Adam first, and then he formed Eve. And the second reason is Adam wasn't deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. So those 2 reasons, follow this logic, this is really important. Those 2 reasons are 2 principles that support the command that is at the beginning. Why is it wrong for a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man? Why? For these 2 principal reasons. So let me explain why this is important. I can say to my daughter Kara, who's over here, I can say, Kara, I do not permit you to marry a woman. For God created marriage for one woman and one man. So I've got the prohibition, you may not marry a woman, and the reason is God created marriage for one man and one woman. That reason, that principle, applies to more than that specific prohibition. It also applies to why I don't permit you to marry a cat, or a tree, or a 3-year-old. Right? There are a lot of other ways you can apply a principle. Are you following this logic? Okay, this is why this is really important. If these are principles, then that means they apply to more than just that one command. So we should be thinking, how does that principle work? What else might that principle apply to? And I could show you from 1 Timothy 5:4 and 5:17 and 18 how Paul does this repeatedly in his writings. He'll state a command, and then he'll give a reason for it, and the reason is the principle that applies to more than just that command. And it's interesting, in the very next paragraph, I hate chapter breaks. This is another one that's confusing. 1 Timothy 3 is a chapter break. Imagine that chapter break's not there. You have 1 Timothy 2, 9-15, and then you go right into chapter 3. And that's about the qualifications for an elder. It's all connected. Why God's design for men and women is related to why we have this order in the church. The very next paragraph says an overseer must be a man who manages his own household well, keeping with all dignity his children submissive. For if someone doesn't know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? So there's a connection between a man leading his home and a man leading a church. It's fitting for a man to lead. Paul argues in a similar way in 1 Corinthians 11, 7-9. He says, a man ought not to cover his head, since, this is the reason, since he's the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. And then he gives a 4 and a 4. So reason 1, man was not made from woman, but woman from man. And another reason, neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. So if you take that narrow complementarian view that you'd say an unordained, a woman can do anything an unordained man may do, and that God's design for men and women apply only to marriage narrowly and that narrowly in the church, you'd have to ask and answer this kind of question. Why does God command wives to submit to husbands? Why? What's the reason? Why does God command that only men teach and exercise authority over the church? Is it arbitrary? Is it like God could just flip the coin and done it the other way? I'll give you an example. I've got a pair of dress shoes on right now. I don't wear these in certain circumstances. In Minnesota, it snows a lot. When I'm shoveling the driveway, I'm not wearing dress shoes. You know why? I have wet socks and freezing feet real fast. Or when I'm running, or when I'm lifting weights, I'm not wearing dress shoes. They wouldn't help. And I could do it. I mean, I could shovel the driveway in my dress shoes, but I'd ruin my dress shoes and mess them up. It's not like this where I have some Brooks running shoes. I have 2 pairs. I have one for outside and I have one for indoor treadmill, and I don't mix them. Some people think that men and women are like that, where you take these 2 pairs of shoes off the shelf, they're identical, and then you arbitrarily assign, okay, this pair, outside, this pair, inside. Or it's like 2 basketballs. They're identical. This one, indoor basketball. This one, outdoor basketball. And it could have gone the other way. And some people think men and women are like that. Like it's arbitrary. Okay, we have men and we have women. All right, these ones you lead, these ones you follow, but it could have gone the other way. It's just, who knows why it's the way it is, but this is what God said, so let's just do that. And that's like the narrow view. It seems arbitrary. There's not a reason underneath the rule. I'm arguing, no, God is so kind to give us reasons. It's not like 2 basketballs that are identical that we arbitrarily assign indoor-outdoor. It's more like we have a football and a tennis ball. Now, you can try to play tennis with a football, and you could try to play football with a tennis ball, but that's just not fitting. The balls actually correspond to the sport really well. And the way that God made men and women correspond to what He wants them to do. It's fitting. God's brilliant in His design. So why is it most fitting for a man to teach and exercise authority over the gathered church? Why is it most fitting for a man to lead his family? Why, and this is where you might think, whoa, Bible doesn't say that. Why is it most fitting for a man to be a police officer? Whoa, the Bible never says that. What I'm just doing is using the logic and applying it in another sphere. If a police officer is chasing down bad guys and tackling them and handcuffing them and putting his life on the line and protecting people, that's a job that's fitting for a man. That's what I teach my daughters. Now, this is where people get kind of nervous because they want a Bible passage that says exactly that, or else they say, who are we to say? I'll say the same thing about President of the United States. It's fitting for a man to be the leader of a nation, especially when he's the commander of the military. He's the chief. That is fitting for a man to do. Now, I'm transgressing our culture right now, aren't I? I don't care. I'm actually the sane one. I'm recognizing reality and calling it what it is. And my goal is to take what God says and wisely apply it. That's wisdom. Apply it to the nitty-gritty of life. Now, you gotta be careful when you apply it that you don't treat the applications exactly the way you teach what God explicitly says. You could recognize, I could be misapplying this one. I don't think I am. But just recognize what you're doing is you're taking principles from Scripture and applying them as best you can in your context. Okay, that's reason number 2. Male headship is fitting. That's the logic of 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Corinthians 11. That is, a second reason. Here's a third reason. I need to speed up here. I'm going to have to go into hyperdrive. A wife's submission to her husband is fitting. You see that word fitting again? That's the second time I've used it. I'm going to say more about that in a minute. So this is the logic of Colossians 3 and Ephesians 5. Here's what Colossians 3 says. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Look at that word fitting in line 2. Fitting. That translates a word that focuses on what is appropriate, what is proper. It's fitting to play football with a football. It's fitting. It's not fitting to play football with a basketball. I mean, you could do it, but it's not right. It's not fitting. Paul uses that same word in Ephesians 5:4. Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are not fitting. It's out of place. Instead, let there be thanksgiving. So some things are fitting based on how God designed the universe, and one of those is that wives should submit to their husbands. That is fitting. And we can unpack this further by examining the parallel passage in Ephesians 5. Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ in 3 spheres. The first one is wives to husbands. Submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. 4, why is this fitting? The husband is the head of the wife. Notice, it's not the husband should become or should be or should aspire to be. He is. So husbands, you are the head. So be a good one. The husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound. I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see to it that she respects her husband. So, real clearly, 2 different emphases when Paul addresses the women and when he addresses the men. Women, submit to your husbands. Respect them. Husbands, love your wives. Sacrificially be leading them for their good. They're 2 different fitting exhortations. I have probably a 20-minute detour here I'm going to skip, but I'll show you the slides that I'm going to skip over. What does it mean that a husband is the head of his wife? It means he must lovingly lead his wife. It doesn't mean he's inherently better, or that he may selfishly treat his wife in a harsh or domineering manner, or that he may selfishly abdicate his leadership to his wife the way that Adam did. So there's a poem by G.K. Chesterton that emphasizes this first one, that a husband's not inherently better than his wife. If I set the sun beside the moon, and if I set the land beside the sea, and if I set the flower beside the fruit, and if I set the town beside the country, and if I set the man beside the woman, I suppose some fool would talk about one being better. It's not what we're talking about. And then a wife is responsible to submit to her husband. I'm just going to give you the passages here. Colossians 3:18, Ephesians 5, which we've read, Titus 2, 1 Peter 3. All of these passages are emphasizing that a wife should submit to her husband. So what does that mean? It means she should gladly follow her husband. It does not mean that she may manipulate her husband, or grudgingly follow her husband, or mindlessly follow her husband, or that all women must submit to all men. That's not what this is talking about. This is that a wife intelligently, gladly follows her husband. And that is fitting. That's argument number 3. A wife's submission to her husband is fitting. Now, let's conclude here with argument number 4. Husbands and wives have different obligations that flow from their distinct identities as men and women. This is the logic of 1 Peter 3. Again, we've already seen this in Ephesians and Colossians. When God commands husbands and wives, the commands are different. Here's how it's different in 1 Peter 3. Wives, be subject to your own husbands. And he elaborates on that. And then husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they're heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Why are the commands to wives and husbands different? It's because husbands and wives have different obligations that flow from their distinct identities as men and women. That's why. So this is a really good test. Parents, if one of your children asks you, Daddy, Mommy, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What is a woman? Matt Walsh. What is a woman? Do you have an answer? I mean, you could do a woman is an adult human female who needs help opening pickle jars. That's one way to go. And that's a good definition. But there's more you can say. There's an article I'd recommend to you. I'd commend it to you by Kevin DeYoung. And see if I can find the name of it. Oh, I didn't write it down. No, I did. Here it is. It's called How Are Men and Women Different? Kevin DeYoung. If you Google that, you'll find it. And he gives an A, B, C, D, E way to remember it. So A, men and women have different appearances. So this is the plumbing, the biological differences. You can tell that they're different and that you should dress accordingly. From a distance, someone should squint. Is that a man or a woman? You want to, if you're a man, be a man. And then B is body, which is talking about gender. And I'm using that word less and less because people think gender means it's fluid and you choose it. So the word sex indicates a biological reality that's unchangeable. So I'm using that word more often these days. C is character. There's a reason that God enjoins women to be respectful, pure, gentle. And he enjoins men to show honor and understanding and caring leadership. And that you could deduce from that the crowning characteristic of a woman is true beauty, inside and out. And the crowning characteristic of a man is true strength, inside and out. Strong enough to say no to pornography. That's true strength. And then D is demeanor. In 1 Thessalonians 2, Paul describes his own ministry among the Thessalonians like a nursing mother. So he's gentle, affectionate, and sacrificial. And he also describes his ministry as fatherly, which is full of exhorting and encouraging and leadership. So that helps you see that the demeanor of a woman is to be gentle and affectionate and sacrificial. The demeanor of a man is to be exhorting and encouraging and leading. And then finally is an eager posture. The wife should be willing to be led. The husband should be eager to take the sacrifice and to lead. So I'm going to stop here. The next argument is talking about natural theology. But I'm going to pause and just remind you that God's good design for men and women is not arbitrary. It's not like if you flip a coin, go up, heads, men, you lead. No, it's not like that. God made men and women particularly for what he wanted them to do and be. And we see this in Genesis 1-3. We see it in 1 Timothy 2, in 1 Corinthians 11, in Colossians 3, in Ephesians 5, in 1 Peter 3, and many other passages. I'm going to pause here. You may have questions right now. So I encourage you, write those down right now, so when we come back after the service, we can discuss this some more. I'm going to give 2 more brief arguments in favor of this view, and then we can discuss this. My hope right now is that the words of God that we looked at this morning would reinforce for you God's design that's different for men and women, different and complementary, is good. And I want to follow it. I want my family to follow it. I want my church to follow it. I want my society to follow it. Because it's good all the way down for everybody. Let's pray. Lord, help us to love what you love and hate what you hate, particularly the way you designed men and women. Amen.